after me. I'm a man. I'm 40.
Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm Nick DiMartino.
That's Liam Barwick.
Yeah, sorry. Started a little quickly. I kind of jumped out at you. This is a new episode of Moving the Goalpost. You can follow me on Twitter at Nick DiMart. You can follow Liam at Liam MTGP. And you can follow this show at MTGP ETB on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can follow the Empty the Bench Network on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at ETB Network. You can find us on YouTube. You can follow all the Empty the Bench Network shows on youtube.com/ETB Network. You can find us at on ETB Podcast, all the Empty the Bench Network podcasts, including this one at etbpodcast.com. You can listen to Moving the Goalpost wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to like and subscribe. And of course, this show is presented by Playback. Watching sports is more fun with others, but we spend too much of our time watching alone. Playback is a virtual space where communities can stream live sports together with everyone perfectly synced up. Creators can hop on stage, deliver their own play-by-play analysis and commentary, and invite viewers up for Q&A. Playback makes watching sports fully interactive and a social experience. From playing fantasy sports, repping your favorite players and teams, and watching with the commentators and communities you care about. Win or lose, sports are best enjoyed together. Join our community by going to playback.tv/ETB Network to find out more, including our live stream schedule. Okay, so obviously, there's the big news right now is free agency. We got to start off with the Knicks, who have had a rather, I would say, eventful offseason so far. Overall, I think a pretty good offseason so far. We just signed Anunoby to a max deal, which we didn't. Obviously, Mikal Bridges, which we gave some draft picks away. But overall, I would say this has been a very good offseason for the Knicks. We're not the only team making moves. We kind of had to make some of these moves to keep up because a lot of other teams in the East are going to be more competitive. I think the Knicks are also going to be more competitive. I would say my reaction so far with the Knicks is that I would say I'm cautiously optimistic. The reason I say cautiously is because even though I think on paper we're a better team, there is no predetermined outcome. And, there is such thing as luck, and a lot of luck can be involved. And just because they're, I think, better than last year's team, that doesn't mean we're going to finish in a better place. But I think it would be very disappointing if we don't.
They had a good offseason, I thought. Like the Bridges trade, I thought was a good move. It makes them I guess it depends what you mean by finishing in a better position. But that's a good move. I liked re-signing Anunoby. I said on this show months ago they weren't going to sign Hartenstein because it was going to be too much money, which it was. I don't think you can fault the Knicks at all for not re-signing Hartenstein because they weren't going to pay him that much money, and you can't fault Hartenstein for going to Oklahoma because he got more money and he's still on a contender. And I think there was a lot of overreaction. To Hartenstein leaving. I think that the Knicks are still in a decent position with Mitchell Robinson, who has to stay healthy, which is a gigantic question mark. And same with Julius Randle is a gigantic question mark. But if you talk about finishing a better position, they finished with the number 2 seed in the East last year, and they if they were healthy, they would have went to the Eastern Conference Final. So let's say they're the second best team in the East last year. If I think, does this make them better than the second best team in the East? No, I do not.
No, I agree. I don't think they're any better than the second best team in the East. I mean, well, here's the thing. Like I said, I don't think that the better team even if the team has gotten better, it doesn't mean that they're going to finish better because it's not like there's a uniform fixed level of competition. Competition can go up and down every year, and there's no predetermined outcome. Anything could happen when you look at like injuries and things like that. It's like, sure, the Knicks have gotten better, but so have the Sixers and the Celtics. But you also have to consider the fact that part of the reason the Knicks were the second best team in the East was injuries. Maybe they wouldn't have been if Paul George had been traded to the Sixers last year, or if Giannis hadn't gotten injured. So, I mean, there was some. I mean, Knicks were devastated by injuries last year, no doubt about that. But they also benefited from other teams' injuries to a large degree. So that also has to be taken into account. So, but yeah, Hartenstein. When you talk about Hartenstein, he got paid. He's getting paid like $87 million, 3 years, $87 million. It's not just that he wasn't worth the money. The Knicks couldn't give him the money because of the CBA. The max deal they could have offered him was $72.5 million for 4 years. Now, if the Knicks had signed Hartenstein for a 3-year deal when they signed him 2 years ago, and then his contract was up, they would have been allowed to because of what they call the early bird rights. So there's a lot of weird things with it. So basically, they offered him the most that they could offer. And no, I don't think Hartenstein's worth that money. And you know what? Here's the thing with Anunoby. I like the Anunoby deal. The thing is that I was a little skeptical of paying Anunoby, thinking it wasn't worth it. But the thing is, you just have to pay these guys. Like we can't be like the Wilpons and not end up paying for stars. And Anunoby had, as long as he stays healthy, I mean, he had very good production last year when he was on the Knicks. I mean, if you look at the record of how good of games that he played in and games that he didn't, there's a very drastic difference. I mean, the Mikal Bridges trade, I think, was just perfect because like some Knicks fans, I think, were overreacting to the whole draft picks thing, which I never really understood. The Knicks have an abundance of draft picks for a reason. It's not because you need it's not because you need 4 draft picks in 2025, 4 first-round picks. Nobody does. The reason you have these draft picks is basically used as currency. I mean, what is the likelihood that some mid-20s first-round pick, some first-round pick in the mid-20s or something, is going to pan out to be some type of star? I mean, most of them probably won't pan out at all. I mean, if you just look at the history of the NBA draft, like that's like what Kevin Knox, he was drafted somewhere in that range. So the likelihood that, you know, the Knicks didn't really give up. I don't think they gave up that much. It's one of those, it's kind of like prospects in baseball. Like bad teams like the prospects and good teams trade the prospects. It's the same thing now. It's like bad teams like the Nets, they want the draft picks, and good teams like the Knicks, who are contenders, trade the draft picks. That's usually just how it works. And there was nothing they could have done about Hartenstein. I think people are overreacting a little bit to the Hartenstein loss, even though I'm not saying it's not nothing, obviously. Hartenstein's a good player. He improved tremendously. And look, like you said, nobody can blame him. And in fairness, I don't really see anybody blaming him. I mean, he got substantially more money. He earned it. And not only did he get more money in salary, it's cheaper to live in Oklahoma City. And I don't know if they have a state tax in Oklahoma. So, you know, all of that taken into account, it's substantially more money. I think that the one thing would be like, oh, what do we do about Randall? That's the one question. And well, also, it's not just that, but the thing is that like Hartenstein seems to me like a player, even though he deserves a lot of credit. I think a lot of it was also a bit of a product of Thibodeau and, you know, him getting the most out of players, which Thibodeau does a lot. you have to remember, Hartenstein was basically a nobody coming out when the Knicks signed him. Like most Knicks fans did not know who he was. I didn't know who he was when they first signed him. And nobody would have expected him to be as good as he was. We could probably do the same thing with somebody else who has a similar type of profile as Hartenstein.
Yeah, exactly. Which I said last time, they could get someone similar. And again, like they made a good trade. Draft picks, I don't think matter in the NBA unless you're unless you're building in the top 5 and you're rebuilding a roster. But when you're a good team and you expect to win a championship, then it doesn't matter about draft picks.
Yeah.
I mean, who did the Knicks take this year? So it doesn't really matter that much. It's not like in the NFL. I mean, in the NFL, draft picks matter because you have to build a 53-man roster, not 12 guys and you're already in. But and most even NFL teams that are competing would give up first rounders for a player that could transcend a team like that. So the draft picks, I don't think matter as much, certainly in the NBA. And so I thought, I don't really mind that they traded draft picks. I mean, I think that there has to be a separate conversation about the Nets. I think are the worst franchise maybe in sports. I mean, they're so poorly run, it's unbelievable. If you talk I just want to mention real quick. So they gave up a ton of draft picks for Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett. Now, a difference between that trade and a lot of trades like the Mikal Bridges trade is that Mikal Bridges is still young. Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce were in close to the very end of their career. They won one series, I believe, with that team. They beat Toronto very late. They got very lucky to beat Toronto, and then they won. Then they lost. So they got clobbered by the Heat 2 different years, and 2 of the draft picks that they gave up ended up being Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. So then they reset their roster. They were horrible for years, which is why 2 of the draft picks were Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. They were horrible for years. They reset the roster. They brought on 3 of the biggest stars in the NBA. And 2 of the guys that they traded, one they traded for Ben Simmons, and the other who doesn't play a game, and the other one they traded with other players, but one of the guys in the deal was Mikal Bridges, who they've already traded away. So I don't know what the hell goes on in Brooklyn, but I think it's underrated how poorly run they are.
Oh yeah, I mean for years. Really they really are. Yeah, if you think about it, it's like, well, spending all that. Not only are they like terribly run right now, it's like they've been terribly run for the past 15, 20 years.
Under 2 owners.
Under 2 different owners and a lot of different GMs. Like it's you're right. It's very underrated how much of a disaster they are. Although I know a lot of Net fans. I mean, I think they would all say it too. Like this team has just been an absolute disaster. And it's not even necessarily that the Mikal Bridges trade was that bad. And it's just that the thing is everything that led up to it. I mean, people were talking about how they threw in the towel, which they did, but it's not like they were competing. They were going to be able to compete with Bridges anyway. And it's not even like it's one thing that led to this disaster of a franchise that led to these disasters. It's like every little thing that happened. And it also seems like a lot of bad luck too, in a way. Like every little, they took chances, and you got to take chances on stars, obviously. Like in hindsight, I don't think they should necessarily have not done that deal, not gotten the big 3 together. It's just that everything went wrong with them, and it just ended up being a total failure in like the most Nets way.
No, they should have gotten the big 3 together. And they would have won a championship if two of the guys didn't get hurt, but they also let them run the entire show.
Yeah, which was the problem.
Normally, they let one person run the entire show. Because Kyrie Irving did far more damage than Durant and Harden did.
Yeah. But the point is they let the three of them, they let them run the show. And also, but like Harden was also not willing to go through any adversity. That was another thing. I think they were, all three of them really are kind of divas in a sense. And if they were able to stick it out a little longer, they could have won a championship. I mean, the thing with Kyrie is that and the vaccine, what happened to be the thing at the time, although there's a good chance he would have disappeared anyway, even if not for the whole vaccine.
But before before COVID even existed, he left for his sister's birthday for a week and didn't tell anybody.
He didn't tell anybody.
And also it wasn't like when the vaccine thing happened, it wasn't like people were like, oh my God, I can't believe that Kyrie Irving is doing something. Like he already had a reputation from his time in Boston that he was going to be a little bit of a head case. And I think that, I think that it also was just not. It just didn't work when Kyrie sort of branched away. And I mean, Harden carried the team. People forget how good Harden was, I think, that year. He completely carried that team. And so, it was just a whole disaster. But yeah, they're really, and now you would think, okay, like we trade Durant, but now we have Bridges to build around and whatever. And now they've traded him too. So.
But the thing is, they couldn't build around Bridges. It just wasn't enough. It's not like they were going to get a bunch of other stars in order like Bridges is a very good player, but he's not like a number one guy. Like you're not going to win with him as like your number one guy. So they were just like, all right, we might as well just trade him. I mean, teams do things like this all the time because they know they're not going to be able to compete with this one guy. I mean, it happens the Nets, they remind me a little bit of the Mets, a lot of the Mets, just the way they're run. I mean, spending insane amount of money trading just for like old has-beens, basically, which is what the Mets did with pitchers 2 years ago. It's the same kind of thing that the Nets did with Kevin Durant and Paul Pierce. It's very, I guess it is a bit underrated. I guess the thing is, I think that the Knicks have also had a lot of have been run terribly often throughout the years too. But the Knicks always get more. The Knicks will always naturally get more attention for it because the Nets are the little brother team and the Knicks are just more popular and a bigger brand. So I think it's talked about a lot more. I mean, one thing about that big three thing though was the Nets, they like overnight became a national story from having Kyrie, Harden, and Durant. And which was a change, I would say. I mean, maybe in New York, the Knicks were still a bigger story because there's a lot more Knicks fans than Net fans. But nationally, the Nets became a huge story just overnight from creating the big three. And here's how you know if an era has failed. You know that an era has failed when the best part of the era is when it starts, when you sign the players. That's how you know the era was a disaster. The best part of the big three Brooklyn Nets era, it was the day they signed them. That was the day they signed Durant and Kyrie was the best day of the whole era.
Yeah.
I guess it's very similar to the Knicks signing, the Mets signing Scherzer. The best time was the best day of Max Scherzer being on the Mets was the day they signed him. It's the same type of thing. And then it just ended terribly. It's a very similar sort of thing.
Right.
But yeah, overall, I'd say I think that in sports, and there tends to be a lot of overreaction from fans. And I think there was a lot of overreaction when it came to the Knicks and losing Hartenstein and all of that. But look, I think they're going to continue to make more moves. They're going to need to. They're going to need to make more moves. They're going to be able to replace. I think they'll be able to replace Hartenstein at least to a certain degree, like somebody who can at least kind of fill that role. So,
Right.
like if your biggest thing for the offseason, if the biggest downfall is that they traded away a bunch of they traded away first round picks and they lost Hartenstein, it's not the end of the world. I mean, especially when there was nothing they could have done about Hartenstein. It's not like they were too cheap. They couldn't do it. They couldn't offer him more money even if they wanted. So, nothing to really say about that.
Correct.
I think the biggest question mark is Randall. What are they going to do about Randall if they're going to re-sign him?
What do you mean? What are they going to do about him?
Like, what are they going to do with Randall? Like, do you think they'll re-sign Randall?
Yes.
You think they will?
Yes.
I think they probably will too. Yeah, I would say that based on their actions for the most part, I think they probably will. Some people say that he doesn't fit very well. Maybe that's true. He didn't, but I don't. I think you got to just. I think you kind of have to. I think the Knicks kind of have to. Did you see? I do want to talk a little bit more about this. Paul George to some more free agency. Paul George to the 76ers. So the Knicks, even though the Knicks made some good moves, obviously in the offseason, it doesn't really help when the Sixers, a division rival, also gets better in the process. So I guess the Knicks, it might end up being it might end up evening out for the Knicks. Overall, this is a good move. He's being paid a lot of money. Wait, let me just pull up his contract. He's being paid like, hold on, let me just 4 years, $211 million. So that's obviously, like, the money now in the NBA has just gotten insane. But yeah, obviously they had to make this move. They had to compete, and one thing in the NBA now is that, like, every little, I mean, it's always been like this, but every one player makes a very, very big difference. And the Sixers' biggest problem was Embiid wasn't healthy all year. They could have actually been able to compete for most of the season. They would have at least finished better in the playoffs, or at least had a higher seed if they had somebody like Paul George.
Yeah, I mean, I think they were a really good team last year. They probably were better than the Knicks if Embiid was healthy. They probably would. The Knicks wouldn't have been the 2 seed, I don't think, if that had happened either.
I don't think anybody thinks that.
So I think they are good. I think they still haven't really done enough to address a lot of their issues with depth.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the Knicks beat the Sixers last year because of their depth was better, and because the Knicks also put in a lot more effort than the Sixers, and that was evidenced on the rebounding stats in that series. So I think while it's a good move, it's certainly a good move. It's a lot of money, $50 million a year, and the Sixers still have to stay healthy, and Paul George has to play his best games in the playoffs, and neither of those things have happened yet.
Yeah, but it's at least a start. That's the thing. I mean, like Paul George obviously is not known for being good is not known for being a good playoff. He's not known for being good in the playoffs, but that doesn't mean that, like, him as an addition doesn't mean that you can't win something with him as an addition. It's just that you don't want him to be the main guy. I still think I agree with most of what you said, although I think any sort of move is still a big deal. I mean, Paul George joining the Sixers with the way the competition is in the East right now, with the top, I mean, at least with the top teams, the way the competition is in the East, one player is a big deal. And look, there's not much more they could have done. And the other thing is, I mean, before we signed and OG, there was a lot of talk about him going to the Sixers. Imagine if the Knicks didn't sign Anunoby. Imagine if they had been said he's not worth the money, and then he ended up going to the Sixers. How much of how bad that would be for the Knicks? Like you would just be missing out on one of your best players, and he's going to a division rival. That would have been such a disaster. So that's another thing that like I think everybody has to understand with draft picks. I think just being and spending money. The Knicks right now, they're in a position where they have to be aggressive in free agency and who they sign. So like they're just in a position where it's like you can't worry about draft picks and you can't worry too much about spending money. Like they're just in a position where they just have to be able to compete in the East. Where they're competing with the Celtics and the Sixers and maybe even the Bucks, while they're it's just a position that they're really just doing what they have to do. But I mean, so far, I guess there's more that they have to do in terms of depth. But I still think the biggest issue with the Sixers going into the season is just going to be the fact that Embiid is always hurt. That's still going to be the biggest thing. But if he was hurt, he played hurt last year. But if he had somebody better like Paul George, then they would have at least had a chance.
Yeah, I agree, but I still think that they have issues. They have issues. They're still not as deep a team as the Knicks or the Celtics.
Yeah, no, the Celtics are like ocean level deep. The Celtics are kind of like UConn was. Like they are deeper than everybody else in the NBA. It's not even close.
Agreed.
Yeah, they have the deepest. They have the deepest roster. Obviously a lot of stuff going on in the East. In the West, Klay Thompson to the Mavericks. Klay Thompson got traded to the Mavericks. It's finally the Splash Brothers era is over. After Splash Brothers era is over. This is obviously a very good move for the Mavericks. You have to look at, like we were just saying, the Mavericks made it to the NBA Finals. They lost. The biggest, Kyrie was terrible in that series, especially when he was playing in Boston. We saw a lot of memes about with like Luka Doncic with him standing there, like the LeBron no help meme that we saw with Luka. Yes. He was carrying the team on his back that series. Yep. And they're getting him some help. People keep talking about, the narrative around Klay Thompson is very much, I think the narrative around Klay Thompson is similar to the narrative around Russell Wilson in a sense, which is he's not even close to as good as he used to be. He's a veteran, and has had some great success, but is not nearly as good as he once was. And it's very true to an extent. To a degree, I think that argument is actually very much correct. But the Mavericks, they had to make this move. They're not paying him that much money. It's only like roughly 18 or 19 million a year that they're paying him for only a couple more years. It was a trade. So he has like, I think 2 more years on his contract. So it was they didn't give up much. I think this move honestly was a no-brainer.
It's 25 over 2 years. It's 50 over 2 years, so 25 years.
Yeah.
The narrative around Klay Thompson is correct, though. I think he's look at what he did in that. Look at what he did in that last playoff game they had, where he went 0 for 10. I think that now you can never you never like lose shooting ability, but I just think that he's not been the same person since his injury a few years ago. He's not been as productive as he was, hasn't been as big to the Warriors team as he was. And so I don't know. I don't think that this makes Dallas drastically better than they were the day before they signed him. I just think that it's a good name, but I don't know if he's going to. I don't know if he's going to really produce anything for them.
Well, yeah, that might be true, but like I said, like at least it's something. Like you're right. There's a good chance that he might just not. You're right about that. To an extent. By the way, let me be clear. I am not saying the narrative about Klay Thompson is not true. It is very much true. Just like I think the narrative about Russell Wilson is very true. But that doesn't mean he can't be. That doesn't mean he can't be a solid addition, and that doesn't mean that he can't be worth a small, like a relatively small price. And you were saying that they're not drastically better. I mean, I guess that's true. I mean, I don't necessarily think they're drastically better, but at the same time, in the NBA playoffs, it's not always like the difference between teams is usually not drastic. The difference is very subtle usually, and really just often about matchups. So any little thing could be a bigger deal than you think. I mean, the Celtics were proved to be a drastically better team than the Mavericks last year. But any sort of move that they had to make some type of move at least. So to me, it's like they're just doing what they can. So his average salary for this 3-year deal, so it's $50 million for 3 years. So 16 and 2/3 million on average. So basically he's being signed to like a veterans deal, which is, I think, a very, very worth it. Like you're right. He doesn't necessarily make them drastically better, but I think that having an extra shooter, an extra 3-point shooter, an extra wing could be very underrated. And that could be a pretty big thing for them. And they're paying a small price. I mean, 17 million per year, less than that. I mean, that's nothing. So to me, I think it's not like they're trading away their whole future or anything like that, or spending the same amount of money. So I think that, I mean, and by the way, maybe like the Mavericks are a little bit better. But I mean, it's not even just getting an extra player. It's also like Kyrie living up to his expectations a little bit. I mean, a lot of it is that too. Maybe they would have had a little bit more of a chance if Kyrie was able to actually do something when they played in Boston. So that part of it obviously is also important.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad move. I just think that it's not. I just don't think it makes them that much better.
No,
and I think that they had a few problems more defensively than offensively last year.
Yeah, but yeah, no, that part is obviously true. But one move that I think might make the team drastically better, possibly Chris Paul to the Spurs. He signed well, maybe not drastically better, but he signed a 1-year, $11 million deal with the Spurs. I think it's first of all, it seems like Chris Paul's been on like almost every team. He's been all over the league. He's kind of like Rondo or Lou Williams. Like, what team has he not played on? It feels like.
Yes.
I guess the only thing I'm surprised is that it was only 1 year. This is a very, very good move, I think, for the Spurs, mainly because it's so cheap. I mean, $11 million for a player like Chris Paul. I mean, I understand he's not the player that he's a shell of his former self.
Right.
Part of the reason I think this is a good move for the Spurs is that going into this, I don't know exactly how it's going to be this year. Obviously, it's going to be a little different. You have a bunch of young players. In fact, obviously Wembanyama, the number 1 pick in the draft. The Spurs going into last season, they were the youngest team in the league. Veteran leadership, like from a guy like Chris Paul, I think could be very underrated. And now, not just because he's a veteran, there are some veterans that won't do anything. I mean, you could I'm not just because he's a veteran, but he's a playmaker. He is a very, true point guard. And he does, I mean, it's going to be, I think he can make a very big difference for the Spurs. Like I was saying, I was just sort of surprised it was only 1 year. That was the only thing I was kind of surprised at.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if they were going to really sign someone at his age to a big,
not a big deal,
a big time deal like that. So I don't think I was that surprised by the 1 year. And I think, like you said, I think that he would be used more for his leadership role. But I think that in terms of playing ability, like you said, he's a shell of his former self. I think that he's like you said, good veteran leader. He's going to bring a lot of leadership to the team, but I don't think that he's going to push them to being a playoff team or anything like that. past in this season. I mean, anything past being a leader, I don't think that he's going to be a guy that contributes so much that they go from one of the worst teams in the league to a playoff team. But I think it could have been a good move in terms of the leadership role and bringing more veterans to help out with Wembanyama and things like that. And the young team that they have, I think that is more of where he will be helpful to them, especially towards the future than this season.
Yeah, no, I agree. But you also have to think like the reason they were one of the worst teams in the league last year is because they had the least experience. They were one of the youngest, just like the Pistons were one of the youngest. Now they have now they're old. Now they're a little bit older than they were. They're a year older than they were last year. And Wembanyama is on his second season, so they can expect a bit more from him. I think that the difference between the two seasons, I think, can be pretty drastic. Has nothing to do with Chris Paul, with or even without Chris Paul. So it's not totally unfeasible that they could be a borderline playoff team. I'm not just because they were one of the worst teams last year. So if they are, like, I'm not saying Chris Paul by himself makes the Spurs a borderline playoff team. Obviously, he doesn't. But if they are a borderline playoff team and can be around 500, because now to make the play-in game, you really, I mean, now to make the play-in game, you have to be a little bit. I mean, in the West, you have to be a little better than 500, but not much. And so, given all of that, like if they're like a 500 team, roughly, I'm not saying they definitely will, but if they are, I mean, Chris Paul could make a very big difference in that sense. Even though he's a bit of a shell of himself, and like I said, $11 million for a player like Chris Paul is just dirt cheap.
Yeah, I agree.
It's kind of like buying a used car. That's basically what it was. Like, but them signing Chris Paul is like buying a used car. It gets you from point A to point B, but it's nothing to write home about,
Yeah. I agree with that.
So also LeBron signed a 2-year. I don't know if you saw this. LeBron signed a 2-year extension. Surprise, surprise. He signed it. Yeah, so he signed a 2-year, $104 million max contract that includes a player option and a no trade.
Yes,
I'm not surprised by this, given that they bent over backwards to basically keep him happy.
Yeah, I mean, that's why he opted out. He wanted to restructure the deal, and I think this wasn't really a big time surprise. I think that he was going to get a hefty extension. He's been really one of their best players since going to LA. I think they want to keep him, and they know that if they obviously wanted to keep him happy, obviously signing JJ Redick and drafting Bronny Jr., but they also were, how should I say it? If they want to keep him to keep the rest of their guys, like Anthony Davis would probably leave as well if LeBron left. So I think that LeBron is he's sort of the driver of the whole bus.
Well, yeah, LeBron is like the glue holding the team together, and the Lakers know it. And LeBron knows that the Lakers know it, which is why they were doing everything they could. I mean, this is one of the first times. I mean, I just want to talk a little bit about the NBA draft. This was one of the, I remember when we were younger, there were some years where the NBA draft was a really big deal or at least it was a really big deal for like maybe the first 5 or 10 picks. When, like the year Towns got drafted and the Knicks drafted Porzingis, it was like a huge, it was like a whole big production for the first round of the NBA draft. This year, it's a bit more bizarre. It's like the top 5 picks, like the top 10, a bunch of the top 10 picks were French, who we've never even heard of a lot of the first round. Like the biggest story of the NBA draft was Bronny James, who was like, the 55th pick in the draft?
Yeah, something like that. Pretty close to it.
He was a 55th pick in the draft. So it's just crazy how the top so here are the top 10 picks. Hold on a second. hold on a second. Yeah, so it was Zachariah. So the top 5 picks, I like most of them. I haven't even heard of a lot of them.
Yeah.
How many of them were from France? I'm trying to look it up. Like,
Well, that's the first pick.
Yeah. So there were a whole bunch of picks that and there's just naturally going to be less excitement about overseas players because nobody's ever heard of them. But like the biggest story was just Bronny James being the 55th pick.
Right.
There's been a lot of, like you talk about inmates running the asylum, which in a sense, I guess is happening with the Lakers, except in this case, I think it's a bit more justified because LeBron is the glue holding the team together. Bronny James obviously never would have come close to being drafted if it wasn't for LeBron.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I agree with that, but yeah, I definitely think it's somebody that they're going to keep. Like you said, it's more justified. It's somebody who's much better player than anybody else on the team besides Anthony Davis. He's won a championship there. He's been their best player since he got there. And he's still one of the best players in the league, even at his age.
Yeah.
So yeah, it certainly makes sense as to why they're, and not just the Lakers, most of the teams have that he's ever been with, would give him the keys to the whole city there because he is that good and he's that important to any team that he's with.
Yeah, obviously. Like the whole team would fall apart without him, which is why they're doing all that. It's like people kept, like the Bronny James thing, obviously that's the reason they did it, and it's fairly justified, even though he's clearly not good enough to be on a team to play in the NBA. Which is part of the reason, honestly, I found some of the JJ Redick criticism of them hiring him to be so sort of bizarre because you have to look at the entire I found some of it to be a bit bizarre because if you look at the entire context of the Lakers hiring him to be the head coach, obviously it's because he's friends with LeBron. That's obviously the main reason they hired him. And people were criticizing it, but it's do you not realize how important LeBron is to this team? How do you not realize that aspect of it? And people are talking about Sam Cassell, because Sam Cassell has been an assistant coach for 15 years. Why didn't they hire Sam Cassell? The reason is because he's not friends with LeBron, and that's not really what LeBron wanted. And frankly, that's probably a good enough reason because you can't have LeBron leave. And and people are like, he has more experience. He has 15 years of experience as an assistant coach, as if there's a prerequisite for being a head coach. Lots of head coaches have been hired without much experience. It's happened a bunch of times. And also, do you really think that losing LeBron and most likely Anthony Davis and the team is just set back for, the team is one of the worst in the league in terms of its roster, but you have Sam Cassell with 15 years experience. It's obviously that's not going to work. That's just ridiculously idiotic to make that claim. And I'm not even convinced, regardless, that JJ Redick would be a vastly worse head coach than Sam Cassell. That I'm not convinced of at all.
Yeah, I'm not convinced of that either at all. I don't know that there's evidence that I don't think there is evidence that that they're going to be that JJ Redick is going to be that bad of a coach. I think that just people are piling on because he's never been a head coach. But besides that, I think that they're in a good. They're still in a decent position, especially with 10 playoff teams to make the playoffs. I don't think that that's going to really make that big of a difference with him, not with him or with Darwin Ham. And yeah, I like you said, there's no evidence that he's going to be that much worse of a coach or whatever you want to say.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of blowback, but again, he hasn't coached a game, but you could say that as well. He hasn't coached a game. So how could there be criticism? You could say the same exact thing.
Well, I think the criticism would be you could have hired somebody with more experience. But like I said, that experience, like I don't think that just because one head coach has more experience than another, that means he's going to be better. That's not always true. And like I said, lots of NBA coaches have been hired with zero experience. And people make it sound like it was the guy they just brought off the streets. JJ Redick played in the NBA for 15 years. You don't think he knows what he's talking about? He commentates. He's an analyst. He's an NBA analyst on ESPN, and a very good analyst at that. He's shown that he is a very bright basketball mind.
Correct.
More than almost all the other analysts. So I think people are very much overreacting to this. Like, do you really think that a guy whose life was the NBA for the past 20 years can't coach a team? Like it's not rocket science, it's basketball. Like I just find that to be so ridiculous. I mean, it's not like
I agree.
Like football, I think is a little different. In football, you kind of have to work up the ladder. Like just playing for many years doesn't mean you're going to be a good head coach, whether it's college or the NFL. But basketball, I think, is different because I think basketball is a little bit less complex than football. Football, there's a lot more moving parts. Basketball, it's 5-on-5. You don't have a 53-man roster. Like it's different.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't think that that it's like you said. I think he has a good basketball mind. I just don't think that it's that big a deal that he hasn't coached. And I think that, I mean, there was a lot of, and he probably wasn't a good coach, but sort of same thing sort of with Steve Nash. Steve Nash had never coached. Steve Nash was not, he was a player just like JJ Redick came out and went to coaching because he was friends with players on the team of the Nets. And while we were saying that the Nets didn't work out, we were also saying that they should have won a championship if they had stayed healthy that year against the Bucks. And Steve Nash was the coach. So Steve Nash being the coach didn't, just because it was his first time, didn't really stop the Nets from doing anything that year. It was injuries. And the Nets were, I believe they were the 1 seed that year, correct?
Yeah, I think so.
So they were the 1 seed with a coach who has no experience. So I think that whole narrative and stuff is a little overblown.
Yeah, obvious. Yeah, it obviously is, and obviously, I mean, one other example I could think of is like the Knicks. Phil Jackson hired Derek Fisher off of no coaching experience, and the reasons. I mean, at least like in this case, they were doing it because they wanted LeBron to have a say in who they hire, obviously, if not completely just handpick the head coach.
Correct.
In the Knicks case, Phil Jackson picked Derek Fisher because he played under him for many years when Phil Jackson was a head coach, and he wanted to run the triangle offense.
Right.
So, I mean, wanting to keep LeBron on the team by hiring his friend, I think is much more justifiable than Phil Jackson hiring Derek Fisher because he's obsessed with running the triangle offense. Like I think that was, I mean, obviously it doesn't involve LeBron and was not as high profile as this was, but in my view, that is way dumber and a lot less justifiable than wanting to keep LeBron on the team.
Yeah. Correct. I mean, but I think that those are good comparisons. I think the better comparison is the Nets one because they were trying to they basically fired, even though the Nets is a little bit of a different situation because they fired a coach who was doing well.
True.
Like Darwin Ham was not doing well, even though they did win the in-season tournament and they did go to the conference finals the year before. But they weren't doing well, where Kenny Atkinson was doing well. I mean, he took the net team that he took to the playoffs was horrible. Yeah. Like the team that got swept by Philadelphia, or did they lost in 5 Philadelphia? They were really bad. Yeah. I mean, they were giving Jared Dudley a good amount of minutes. That's how bad the roster was. And then he was fired to bring in Steve Nash, who didn't coach. Where at least, and remember, the Lakers also didn't want to bring in JJ Redick. The Lakers wanted to bring in Danny Hurley.
Right. No, you're right.
And
it's not like
they were denied. So JJ Redick was also a second choice.
Right. I think people are forgetting that he was the second choice. And they were like, and like also people were making like coaching doesn't always make a drastic. I mean, there are some really good head coaches. And given some circumstances, I think coaching in the NBA can make a drastic difference, but most of the time it doesn't. And the idea that the difference between hiring JJ Redick and say Monty Williams, Sam Cassell, whoever, like some mediocre head coach might be, that's going to make some type of drastic difference.
Yeah,
is just so silly. Like it doesn't even make any sense. I don't know how anybody can actually believe that. It's just the whole thing is ridiculous. I mean, I don't know. It's just ridiculous. I do want to talk a little. Speaking of the NBA draft, did you see this Kyle Filipowski story?
No, tell me.
So his girl, or I think now fiance, is his fam is 28 and he's 20, and apparently they started dating when he was in high school, and Kyle and Kyle Filipowski's family is claiming that like she groomed him when they were in high school and brainwashed him into cutting off ties with his whole family. It's a really sort of, and she's like a Mormon. So here's what Kyle Filipowski's brother said. He said, "My brother is a victim and was and unfortunately a perfect pawn and target for this girl's lifelong scheme based on human characteristics and growing potential as a high-level prospect, which started taking place in 2019, exactly at the time when she began her pursuit of him." He's 20. So 2019, he was 15. That's completely crazy. She's a Mormon and apparently like convinced him to break off ties with his family, and sure enough, he gets drafted to Utah.
Yeah, well, that worked perfectly for them. Yeah, that's crazy. That's a crazy story. I mean, that's if we believe his family. It could have also been like he had just not got along with his family and they cut off ties and they were sort of using that to make them look bad. But
yeah, that could have been true too.
If not, I think that I think that they have a legitimate concern. I mean, how old is he? So she's a good deal older than him. So yeah, so she would have been like 23 or 24 when he was in high school.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's like it's a cool story, I guess, for him because a lot of guys would like that, I think. But yeah, I don't know about this brainwashing and turning him into a Mormon or whatever. I don't know how good he's going to be in the NBA if this is going to work out that well. But I guess it did work out well for her.
Yeah, I mean, look, they're accusations. I don't know how accurate they are, but if that timeline is correct, even if the brainwashing thing isn't accurate, if that timeline is correct, it's a very creepy story.
Yeah, it's really creepy, and I think it doesn't get as stories like this don't get as talked about when it's a female that's older and a male that's younger. Versus when if it was a male, if it was a different story with, like a WNBA player or something, and it was a guy, then it would be like completely like on the news and stuff like that. But I just think it's also looked at differently, certainly when it's a man that's younger. But yeah, it's a crazy story. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of athlete stories that have athletes that have cut ties with family. I feel like that goes on.
Yeah, well, Aaron Rodgers comes to mind.
Often, Aaron Rodgers definitely comes to mind.
But stories like this sound like they would happen the other way around. Like the athlete is accused of something like this. That's usually how it happens.
Yeah, I think a lot of times the families and stuff always like to make the athlete sort of look like an asshole. But I think that like in Aaron Rodgers stories, I think like his family is like very like ultra religious.
Yeah.
His parents, at least. Certainly, I don't know about his brother because he won The Bachelor, the Bachelorette. He won rather. So I don't know how that fits into like.
But he doesn't talk to him either.
He doesn't. But I'm saying I don't know if he's as like a devout religious person going on to The Bachelorette. Yeah. But he doesn't talk to him either. So yeah, he's somebody who comes to mind. But yeah, this is a crazy story, and it's interesting too. Like he was a pretty big face in college basketball for the last year or two. So it's kind of interesting also that this only came out now.
Yeah. Well, that always seems to happen when players are going to get drafted.
Well, yeah, I know. Yeah, a lot of that happens. I think that there's a lot of media attention around drafts and stuff like that, and I think that that's maybe more journalists and stuff are calling families, or the families are calling them and saying whatever. But I think that that's it's one of these things where there's obviously animosity, whether it's between him or his family or whatever, and so that's I think they're eager to have the story like that come out, especially during draft time. I don't think they're too keen on him going.
Yeah.
Getting information.
I just want to talk about this. So the USA is out of Copa America in soccer.
Yeah.
Can you explain this a little bit? Because I've been following it a little bit. I don't fully understand how this works, how Copa America works.
Yeah. So Copa America is basically it's like the European Championships, but for South America, and the United States is hosting it for the second time ever. It's a massive tournament. It's one of the biggest soccer tournaments in the world. The USA, last time we hosted it was in 2016. We went to the semifinals. The U.S. is one of the best teams in the world, according to the rankings. They're ranked 15th in the world. They had a lot of expectations going into this tournament, especially as people build up to the World Cup in 2 years, which is in the United States for the first time in over 30 years. So the U.S. had a lot of expectations. They were in a very easy group. So if you don't know, you have to get through the group. You're in a group of 4. You play the other 3 teams, and the top 2 teams from the group go on to the international knockout stage. And the U.S. we're in a group with Uruguay, who's ranked below them. They're 18th, and Bolivia, who's ranked 84th in the world, and Panama, who's ranked in the 70s. And the U.S. didn't get out of the group. They lost to Panama in a very shocking defeat, and they lost to Uruguay on Sunday. So there's a lot of outcry to fire the coach, which they definitely should, but they're going into the biggest 2 years, the biggest 2-year stretch in American soccer history as they get ready to host the World Cup. And a lot of people thought they were going to go quite far in this tournament. They did last time. They would have played Brazil or Colombia if they had gotten through the group, which would have been a massive game. And there was a lot of expectations on the team, and they fell short. And so there's a lot of questions about the coach and so on and so forth. So it was very surprising. They have a lot of good players, a lot of players who play professional soccer in Europe. This is the best U.S. team. Talent-wise, it's the best American team I think we've ever had. So and we're hosting the tournament. There was a lot of expectation for them to go through. There was a lot of hope for them to go through. and make a serious run. A lot of experts had them going as far as going to the finals. So the fact that they didn't even make it out of the preliminary stages was a shock.
Yeah. Well, was Team USA like a heavy favorite against Uruguay and Panama?
They weren't a favorite against Uruguay, but they were a gigantic favorite against Panama and Bolivia. So they beat Bolivia handily. Then Panama, they had a guy get a red card. You know what a red card is?
Yeah. So it's like you get ejected.
Right, but you don't get the player back, so you're playing with a man down the entire game.
Oh, so it's like if in basketball there was a flagrant 2 and you had to play with 4 players on the court.
Correct. For as long as the game is. So early in the game, one of the Panama players was either getting, I don't know what, he was getting under the skin of one of the U.S. players, Tim Way, for the early in the game, and Tim Way hit him in the head. And the U.S. guy on the U.S. hit the guy from Panama in the head. And he got a red card. So the U.S. played a man down. They were supposed to, they were very heavy favorites against Panama. They were supposed to get through. I mean, this tournament, Canada got through to the knockout stages. And the U.S. and Mexico as well, by the way, who didn't play very well. Mexico didn't either. But for Canada to get through to the knockout stages and the United States to not in a tournament they were hosting is bad, especially there was so much emphasis on this because of the next 2 years, which will lead up to the World Cup in America.
I have a dumb question. How often does Copa America happen?
Every 4 years, but it's never it's normally played in. So all these international tournaments are every 4 years, but it's normally played in South America. It's a South American tournament. But they did a special edition where the U.S. hosted 8 years ago. So the U.S. is only in it when they host. And so normally it's like Brazil, Argentina. I mean, all these teams are in it, Colombia. And now the U.S. is in it.
It sounds like there's a lot of non-South American teams in it besides the U.S.
Only because it's being hosted in the U.S.
Oh, so if it wasn't hosted in the U.S., Panama, Mexico, they wouldn't be in it?
No. So
normally it's just South America.
Normally it's South America. It's a big tournament, but for it was supposed to be held in Ecuador this year, but there's so much like political turmoil in Ecuador that they decided to host it in the United States. And then obviously Messi plays in the United States, and he was drawing a big crowd. I mean, I went to a game at MetLife that was Uruguay and Bolivia, not great countries, but not great teams, but they were 65,000 at the stadium. So it's a big tournament. It's basically akin to the European championships that are going on in Europe right now, but for South America. But it was a big deal. I mean, it topped Sports Center all day. And the coach of the United States I don't know if you know this, but so the coach of the United States was fired I would say after the World Cup. It might have been before then. Anyway, 2021, 2022, he gets fired, the coach. Greg Berhalter is the coach. He got fired. They put together an exploratory committee to find a new coach. And the exploratory committee found and hired Greg Berhalter, who was just fired. So they fired him, created an exploratory committee to hire the new coach, then fired the new coach. Then the father so Gio Reyna is from New York City. He's one of the best players on the United States team. Greg Berhalter has some beef with Gio Reyna's father. So he wasn't playing Gio Reyna. He was sitting him on the bench, even though he's one of the best players. And then Gio Reyna's dad was blackmailing Greg Berhalter, the coach, with evidence that Greg Berhalter had hit his wife in the 90s so that his son could play on the team. He was attempting to blackmail him. And this was about 2 years ago, heading into the World Cup.
This reminds me of the Maria Sophia thing from Curb.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Almost exactly. So, but he wasn't playing his best player one of his best players because he had a beef with the dad originally, which is so ridiculous. And then the dad came out and blackmailed him. So this coach has already had a lot of people calling for him to get out. And then they played a couple of preseason games. Before the tournament, they got absolutely destroyed by Colombia. So a lot of people before the tournament were already had the knives out for the coach to get fired. And now that they were as disappointing as they were, the coach's job is he's as good as fired. Now they haven't done it yet, but they're going to want to bring in someone who's big. I mean, this is a big time tournament for them to host the World Cup, and if they aren't, they have to perform in the World Cup.
Yeah. Interesting. So interesting stuff. All right. So I learned a little bit about soccer, which I don't know much about. All right. So thanks for tuning in, everybody. You can follow me on Twitter at Nick DiMart, Liam at Liam MTGP. You can follow the show at MTGP ETB on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. You can follow the Empty the Bench Network on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at at ETB Network. All right, so we'll be back next week. Thanks for tuning in, everybody.